I'm absolutely delighted to host this webinar with Shashank Saxena, who, as many of you know, is the founder and CEO of VNDLY, which was recently acquired by Workday for $510 million. But equally important, it was one of the biggest exits in the history of our region. And so we just thought it would be a great opportunity to have a conversation. Let's kind of start with the big story. Like what happened?
It's been an interesting journey, right? Because I was very gainfully employed at Kroger. It's not that I was unhappy with my job. It's not like I was running away from something. Narayan and I were friends. We crossed paths at Kroger. When we met, we decided to start this company together. And starting the company, what we did was we assimilated a deck where we put 4 really simple hypotheses together. And we started presenting it to VCs around, hey, if these 4 hypotheses are true, we're going to probably have a pretty massive opportunity on our hands. And that's how VNDLY happened, right? It was brainstorming of ideas coming together and then putting them on paper and articulating a very, very specific hypothesis around that. And that writing up the hypothesis piece is one thing I would strongly recommend every entrepreneur to do, because it's very easy to get distracted by a feature that you think is going to be in a company. Whereas once you start putting hypotheses on paper as to how a space overall, a space that you're planning to tackle, whether you're starting a CPG company or an enterprise software company, if you start writing how that space is going to play out in the next 5 to 10 years and all the different headwinds and tailwinds you're going to encounter in that space, you start building conviction. And once you start building conviction internally, it starts eating you up where you just can't sit in the job you are at. So instead of running away from a bad job, bad boss, or things like that, which thankfully in my case, that was not the case, it's a gravitational pull into an excitement of what you can build in the future, right? So if you're thinking of starting a company, don't start it because you want to run away from something, because all your life you'll just keep running away from one thing to the next to the next. Build conviction around a hypothesis. And that's the way I think every company should start, is by spending the time doing the research and writing out the hypothesis.
You got the hypothesis, you found a gap in the marketplace, and you left Kroger, and then
we put down a few slides. We went and pitched to a couple of our friends. The first ones being Dave Knox, Rob McDonald, the Wine Street Ventures team. Dave rekindled a relationship for me with Bowery Capital. We pitched to Mike, and lucky for us, like literally the first institutional fund we pitched to bought into the hypothesis, and they're the ones who led the seed round. Of course, we did a whole bunch of pitches. We pitched to, I think, 16, 17, 18 other VCs. And Mike was already interested in leading. So we had a bunch of angel investors, a lot of executives from local companies, Kroger, P&G, and elsewhere also were investors in VNDLY. And that's how we got started. Once we had gone ahead and pitched to Mike and he was committed, I updated my LinkedIn profile because I had already quit Kroger. Quitting Kroger was also an interesting story. I resigned last week of January. My 2-week notice ended up lasting until mid-April. So April 14th ended up being my last day. We went ahead and I updated my LinkedIn profile, and that's when Epic Ventures came through. Epic was another VC fund I met through Centrifuge. I think they were in town to meet Tim Schigel and Sarah Anderson. I had met Nick when I was working at Kroger, actually 2 years or 2.5 years before VNDLY started. And Nick used to ping me a bunch of portfolio companies that he was looking at, or companies he was planning to invest in, just as a friend for friendly feedback. It's like, hey, what do you think of this company? Hey, what do you think of this idea? And based on the feedback, we had spoken, I think, 4 or 5 times. And when he saw my LinkedIn update that I was leaving Kroger, immediately he jumped in, and the $1.5 million round that we were trying to raise ended up becoming $3 million thanks to the team at Epic Ventures, which was, again, a Centrifuge connection or connection that was formed through Centrifuge. So we were super happy because then we were off to the races, right? How often do you hear? And this was back in 2017 when $1 million actually meant a lot more than it means today. So we were trying to raise 1.5. We had 3 million in the bank and we were ready to go.
Well, I'm going to stop you right there because we're going to come back to that in a moment, but I want to go backwards a little bit. As I recall, you arrived in Cincinnati about 15 years ago on a job, an opportunity with UC. Could you say a little bit about how you got here, how you discovered Cincinnati, and then ultimately landed at Kroger?
That's interesting too. So I didn't pick Cincinnati. Cincinnati picked me, is the way I like to say it. I had done my undergrad in computer science from India. I was applying for grad school. Uh, I was living in LA, so I just moved from India to LA. When I saw the cost comparison of attending a school like USC, for example, versus UC, UC was very kind and generous enough to give me a scholarship for grad school. So that's how I ended up in Cincinnati in 2006. I graduated in 2008 with MBA in finance and MS in information systems. So I did 2 masters during my time there at UC. And yeah, so from there my career started. I got an internship and then a full-time job from the UC Placement Center on campus. So Citibank had come to recruit, and I started full-time at Citibank.
And then how did you get to Kroger?
So at Citi, I had multiple different roles, digital strategy being the last role that I was in. Kroger was just starting up digital. So they had a search firm looking for someone to lead the digital group. That's when a recruiter had reached out to me. I interviewed with Kroger and I got the job, and that's how the Kroger journey started. So I was at Kroger 4.5 years and I had a few different roles. So we took the digital and e-commerce team from, I think, it was like 5 or 10 developers when I started in that role, to then it was 300, 350 when I left the role. And then I worked on the corporate strategy side with the executive leadership team at Kroger.
You heard Kroger talk about their P&L, 10 years ago around the e-commerce or the online side. It was practically zero, right? Tell us a little bit about what you saw and how that experience shaped your thinking about what's possible moving ahead.
Yeah, so if you look at the entrepreneurship journey, it was built on 2 foundation building blocks, which I call the entrepreneurship journey, which is how do you do a startup inside of a big company? And those skills are super valuable, right? Because if you think about at the end of the day, what skills do you need to be a successful entrepreneur when you set out on yourself? It's the ability to influence, the ability to sell a vision, the ability to recruit great talent, the ability to build great product. All of those things come into play. So at Citibank, I was very fortunate. When the App Store was brand new and mobility was this big wave, and everyone thought the browser and the web world in terms of the desktop world will die out and everything's going mobile. I got to ride that wave during my career at Citi. And then similarly at Kroger, building out the whole e-commerce business and the dev team and software development organization to build that. I got to play an important role in that as well. So both of those were, I would say, entrepreneurship journeys where within a big company framework, I got to do my own little startup. And that gave the skills, the confidence, and most importantly, the network and access to a great team of people who could execute on any vision. All of that were the building blocks into the entrepreneurship journey, which is going out on your own and starting out on your own.
What I sense, tell me if I'm wrong, is that, one of your competitive advantages was that entrepreneurship experience in a large company. How important are those foundations? I mean, is that something you would say, hey, listen, don't jump into a startup directly out of college, get those foundations, maybe a little bit more digital focus, but what's your advice there?
Yeah, if you look at startups, right, you have to categorize them into the consumer-based startups and the enterprise software-based startups, right? B2C versus B2B. For B2C, because when you talk about startup founder, everyone has like Mark Zuckerberg wearing a hoodie, early 20s, started off in the dorm room kind of impression, right? Because that's the Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, like the most successful of them have had that similar kind of a founding story. Don't assume you're that. Because in the enterprise software world, it's a whole different animal. So if you're starting consumer, great, but consumer is way harder to be successful in compared to enterprise software. Mark Zuckerberg, if he had to wait to get a purchase order signed through the procurement department of a large Fortune 500 company, he would be at his wit's end, right? So you need domain expertise, you need the patience, you need the understanding of the inner workings of a large Fortune 500 company. You need to understand the product that you're building. You need to understand the persona that you're selling to. You need to understand how decisions are made. There is no such thing as one call close, right? As much as people would like to think and fantasize that, it's going to be months and months of long meetings. It's going to be committees and groups of people. It's going to be influencers. It's going to be someone who was not in your demo, in your sales pitch, who's going to come sideways and throw off the whole conversation and override the team that has vetted your product and knows exactly that your product's the right fit. All of those are the realities of what you're going to be working with, right? And all of those also happen to be realities that a Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk don't end up dealing with. So when you think about startup, like you have to understand, like, what is the domain you're playing in? Are you building a B2B enterprise software play? Or are you building a B2C consumer startup? And the skills that you need to run both of them are drastically different.
Let's go back to the big idea. So tell us about the space in terms of where you saw the big opportunity. You talked about confirming hypothesis, but tell us where you landed in terms of this is a gap. Help us understand what you did.
Yeah, so Narayan was working on actually a different company at that point. It was more in the consumer space. And as I just said, I don't want to touch consumer because I know big company inner workings. So we ditched that. I joined forces with him and we started VNDLY. Our 4 hypothesis was very, very simple. The first one is the world of work is changing. There are going to be, 10, 15 years ago, less than 10% of the Fortune 500 workforce was non-employees. When we started VNDLY in 2017 in the pitch deck, we put that number as 33%. Today, that number is between 40 to 44% of the entire Fortune 500 workforce is non-employed.
Growing.
Yeah, so the trend lines, we knew the tailwinds were going to be in our favor because that's growing, right? We're not trying to address a dying market. The second hypothesis was, if you look at the system of record for full-time employees, Workday, Oracle, HCM, a bunch of these companies. Workday has a $60, $70 billion market cap. It's the system of record, the ERP for all full-time employees at a large company. So our whole second hypothesis was, if we build, quote unquote, the Workday, the system of record for the non-employees, which is 40% of the workforce, can we build a company that is worth 8 to 10 billion as a publicly traded company standalone? Right. So that was the validation of TAM in terms of, hey, the opportunity is there to actually build a meaningful company here. The third hypothesis was around the wave of SaaS 2.0. If you think of what's happening in the enterprise right now, everyone talks about digital transformation. When you start thinking about digital transformation, what does that mean? It means modernizing your business processes. And a lot of that, a huge component of modernizing your business processes is replacing old legacy systems with new modern systems that are born in the cloud, right? So that also squarely played in our favor because we had 2 main competitors. One was started in 1998. The other was started in 1999. They're both older than when Y2K happened, just to put things in perspective. So the gut check there was, is this space immune from the wave of SaaS 2.0? Or is this going to be an opportunity where we can come in and replace a 20-year-old legacy incumbent, right? And we felt pretty good about that. And that also validated another really, really big point, because a lot of times I see and hear entrepreneur pitches where they talk about a feature differentiation. And it's like, you cannot take down a massively large company on having one feature that is different or better, right? You have to build platform level differentiation as to what is it that you're going to do or that's going to enable and propel your business that your competitors cannot catch up. And oftentimes it means an architecture gut, a complete rewrite of the whole application, which we know like big companies that have a lot of revenue, a lot of customers on that platform cannot afford to do. So that was super helpful in the third hypothesis. And the fourth one was completeness of platform. In this space, there have been a lot of like the Uber for staffing kind models, which there are dime a dozen of. What we said is, no, we're going to build a multi-module ERP. And that's how we're going to go about it. Our biggest competitor is SAP, and they own a tool called Fieldglass. So literally what we signed up for is going toe-to-toe against SAP in an ERP category, which on the looks of it is not the brightest idea to get started off on, right? Because of how strong they've been in the ERP category. But if you start looking at how things played out, we were pretty confident in our hypothesis. And more importantly, we were more confident in the team that we had assembled and their ability to execute on it.
Define for the audience product market fit.
If you think about product market fit, right, like we had it a little easy because what we were not trying to validate is there a need for a system to manage non-employees? That answer was very clear. There were 72 other VMSs that did that, right? And there were 2 or 3 massive companies in the space that kind of owned the category. So we didn't have to validate, like, is there a need for the product? What we had to validate was in the list of 72 competitors, 2 were successful. There were 70 bodies in the graveyard, so to speak, right? So it's like, what are we going to do different that we are part of the 2 that are successful and not part of the 70 that die trying? And that's the part that we had to validate, is what are we going to build from a software standpoint that is so unique, so different, that not only will we succeed, we will be able to displace a couple of the largest players in the market. And that's where I think the tech team and the ability to execute on the tech really comes into play.
Let's talk about the different stages of raising money. And when you're at the seed stage, what is most important? Is it the plan? Is it the leaders? Is it all the tactical execution? What is most critical? And then as you move to Series A or B, like what are the different kind of requirements?
So first of all, like anything else, this comes down to relationships and trust, right? When I was at Kroger, I was fortunate where I already had a whole bunch of trusted partner relationships, be it with Dave Knox and Rob McDonald when they were running Brandery on that side, be it with Tim Schigel, Sarah Anderson, and VNDLY on the centrifuge side. All of these names that I've just taken, there was mutual one-on-one at a personal level trust, not just at a company level, right? Like personally, I knew each one of them, and they were all willing to help and roll up their sleeves and huddle around to help us in our journey. And that is very, very valuable. If you can't name 2, 3, 4, 5 people today who are influential and well-connected, that are willing to roll up your sleeves and get to work for you to help you out selflessly, having no upside in the mix, like start off there. Because if you don't have those trusted relationships, the odds are you're not going to succeed. In my journey, thankfully, I had those relationships already, which then led to Bowery Capital and Epic Ventures that I spoke about investing in our seed round, which then moved into the Series A and things like that.
Outstanding. How do you balance the growth and the profitability levers?
It's interesting, right? Because at the time when we were building the business, everyone only cared about growth. Like most people didn't care about profitability. Today, given where SaaS multiples sit in the last, I would say 3 months of this year, things are changing now. In our case, in the early stages, hypergrowth is what you should be focused on. So if you think about hypergrowth, there are multiple articles, and I know Tim Schigel says this. I know Neeraj Agrawal at Battery Ventures wrote an article about it, the 3 triples, 2 doubles thing, right? How do you seed money to get to $1 million ARR, and then you go 3 rounds of tripling, right? $1 million to $3 million, $3 million to $9 million, $9 million to $27 million, like 3 triples followed by 2 doubles. 27 to 54, 54 to 108. Once you cross 100 million ARR, you have a unicorn valuation, and suddenly TechCrunch is interested in you and excited about you, right? So if you start thinking about the framework that way, enterprise SaaS actually does have a lot of these kind of frameworks put together. There are playbooks. You're not the first person starting an enterprise SaaS company. So again, surround yourself by people that can instill this knowledge into you, so you aren't learning every single thing the hard way by getting punched in the face time after time, right? Like there are easier ways to learn and experience things, and surrounding yourself by people who have been there, done it, know these things is a really good way to go about it.
So tell us about how you break through the clutter of misunderstanding to just getting people excited about a value proposition.
Yeah, this is a little bit of, the Harvard Business Review myth is what I'll call it. People read a lot of these articles in Harvard Business Review or case studies in MBA school and things like that. And the crux of a lot of this comes down to that flywheel effect that Jim Collins spoke about, where how do you do something? Or, there's a great HBR article about Disney and Disney strategy. Like it's called The Theory of the Firm. Like you build characters, the characters show up in movies, the movies earn money, those become rides in theme parks. You sell merchandise based on that, and like create this whole flywheel effect, right? And a lot of day one startup plans try to go out and build this whole flywheel and network effect around how I'm going to go about building my startup. And that's fundamentally the worst way to go about it, because that's the easiest way to kill the startup. You cannot boil an ocean at once, right? Even someone as incredible as Jeff Bezos didn't have this whole everything store vision. In fact, for the first 5 years, they didn't do anything other than books, right? It was just a bookseller. So if you think you're going to go ahead and build this whole incredible flywheel of 4 or 5 different products and 4 or 5 different businesses, and each one of them, it's like it never works. I've never seen that work, right? So what is your day one plan? Go ahead and focus on that. Like, what are you going to be amazingly good at? And start winning the market share on that. After a few years, once you are the dominant product in the market, you have a brand established, then you can get into adjacent product lines, right? So do not try to articulate a whole 10, 15, 20-year vision with the whole flywheel effect. Like, it just doesn't work that ways.
In some respects, I mean, your model, your sale, your exit is, a great validation of the startup Cincy ecosystem, the centrifuge model. One of the big factors that was certainly seductive to getting me to take this job was that part of the McKinsey report that was written like 10 years ago that, the relationship with the big cos would be like the big competitive advantage. And, that's an area where I think we probably agree is still kind of an opportunity. And I'm trying to be very diplomatic on that, but let's peel the onion a little bit on that. Because number one, I'd love to get your perspective on your experience there, but maybe one additional follow-up is, do you think maybe the opportunity is different now that everybody's had to think and act like a startup in the COVID era? Is there hope for that promise of fast pilots with big companies as a way of accelerating our trajectory as a leading startup hub?
Yeah, and I think COVID has kind of leveled the playing field. But just for everyone on the call, let me take a step back and give a quick context of the McKinsey report that you referred to. So the question posed was, how do we make Cincinnati the startup hub in the Midwest and then in the country, right? How do we make sure like we show up on every top startup report? There are a bunch of meaningful startups in Cincinnati. And McKinsey was brought in, they did a whole analysis on the strength of the region. And as part of the strength of the region, there were things where we have a right to win because we have great universities, great hospital, a lot of IP in the universities and hospital, a great presence of large Fortune 500 companies headquartered. If we go ahead and solve for the capital piece, which is why the Centrifuge Fund of Funds was created, and if we have access to local capital, at that point, startups can start and use these big companies as early pilot customers. And then if you have 3, 4, 5 big brand names as early pilot customers, it gives you the launch pad to then build a meaningful startup, right? So again, the same McKinsey kind of flywheel effect. So that was a theory around this. And what Pete is referring to is where that falls a little flat is because, and not just the local companies in Cincinnati, it's most big companies aren't set up to be early collaborators with startups and be customers number 1, 2, and 3. They're going to be great in terms of bringing scale to already hardened product. So if you think about the whole scale model, most of the large companies in Cincinnati are actually VNDLY customers. It's just they were not customers 1, 2, 3. They were customers 70, 80, 90, or 50, 60, 70, depending on when you talk about it, right? So and that I think is a bigger, broader, big company problem because they're just not set up in a way to mobilize troops to work with a startup.
You see a way forward? I mean, any kind of, speaking candidly, any kind of advice for us as we try to crack the code on this?
So if you think about building an enterprise software company, right? Enterprise SaaS doesn't work when you have 1, 2, 3, 5 customers. You don't make money. You make money when you become the de facto standard for the industry, when you have hundreds of customers, right? Because in SaaS, you're charging each customer a tiny fee of the overall cost that it takes you to build and maintain the software. So if you are designing your product, keeping a particular big company in mind that you worked at, and you're solving for that big company problems, it's not going to work because you need 100 other companies, 200 other companies to be using that same product to get to meaningful scale and to get to 100 million ARR, right? So think about it that way, because if you build using a certain company in mind, you will build custom software that works for that company. So don't keep a company in mind. Think about building product. What works at a product standpoint? And as long as it solves for a need across a whole sliver of companies, that's really where that becomes valuable.
But at what moment, there's like a moment of truth where you're like, boy, do I IPO? Do I sell? Do I, just keep doing what I'm currently doing? Tell us about the pivot point.
Things aren't easy, right? I mean, it's always bittersweet in terms of when you think about it. Yes, 510 million was a decent exit. Is that what we were building towards? No, we were probably building towards a $5 billion IPO. Had we continued standalone, could we get there? Yes, we could. But at the same time, did the synergies with Workday make sense? incredible amounts of sense, right? So it comes down to personal life decisions as to where you are in your personal life. And Pete, you know about this, like I had a major life accident last year, which also played a role in this, right? Because personally, if you go through a life-changing accident, then what do you want to do with your life? And the other thing is, if when we started, and we've discussed this a lot of times, like if there was a company we would ever want to sell to, Workday was right there, number one on the top of that list. So the fact that Workday was very keen and interested in buying it, the fact that Workday was willing to pay the price premium that it took to make sense for our investors, our employees, and everyone else, I think a lot of those factors just came together well. So yeah, and we were already Workday approved partners. We were totally integrated with Workday. We were certified approved partners. So if you look at a lot of these M&As, the way it happens is a company gets acquired and they spend 2 years building integrations and connections. This was completely reversed. We spent 2 years building integrations and connectors into Workday, and then the acquisition happened. And the most important part of this is the voice of the customer. Our relationship with Workday didn't start because we just wanted to partner with Workday. The relationship with Workday started because our customers told us we need to partner with Workday, where they need to be able to see and manage their employee and non-employee workforce seamlessly together, because it didn't make sense to launch Workday and then spend time launching VNDLY to then rebuild all the integrations that they've built with Workday, right? So our connectors were super important. So from a customer standpoint, the customer feedback has been super positive leading up to this, but also post-acquisition.
I was mentioning earlier, I walked in, Union Hall every day when I took this job, and I felt like your workforce kept growing. And what I loved about your workforce, just that level of energy and excitement, and the sense that they're creating something, maybe, reinventing the category. But how do you lead that? How do you build and scale teams?
This is where, I mean, on paper, if you see, you'll think I led them, but in reality, it was quite the opposite, right? Because as an entrepreneur, you go through a lot of these questions and self-doubt, and are we going to make it? Is this going to be successful? Are we just crazy? And every time you would turn around and look at the team, and I'd worked with that team before, I knew most of them. Before, there were long-standing trusted relationships there. And you look at that team and you're like, shit, with this team, if we can't win, there is no way a company can be built, right? Like, this is literally the best team in the industry, and this has to work out. So Chuck Mobley was employee number one at VNDLY. He also happened to be the first person when I became a manager early on in my career. He was the first person I ever managed as a direct report. And he's still very much here as part of the company, right? Tom Ringenbach, I've known him. He led operations at VNDLY, one of the best operators in the world. I've known him for a long time. I've worked with him. And just because when there are these kind of trusted relationships in play, the politics gets out of the equation. And when the company doesn't have politics and the culture is super strong and very trusting, magic happens, right? Because then you don't need 8 meetings to align on a decision. You can move fast. And when you look at us versus a big company that we want to take on, the big company has 15 different advantages. They have more capital, more resources, an established brand. They have referenceable customers. They have every single advantage in the book. A startup has only one advantage: speed. If the startup can execute with speed, and of course, by speed, I also imply not compromising on quality, right? Like, the product has to be good, but that's your only advantage. And when I look at that team around, it's like, we literally have the most talented tech team in the business, and we're a tech company. So if a tech company has the most talented tech team in the business, that very often correlates to a meaningful outcome. So from the outside, it looks as if I was leading the team, but honestly, like, every time I went, and if I was selling a deal, or if I was talking to customers, and every single time I knew that the team is there to execute and deliver, right? And if you look at what's the difference between a con man and a visionary, the answer is execution. And who does the execution? It's the team, right? So if you know the team can come through and execute and deliver, that's the biggest difference.
Given that we have so many entrepreneurs, are there any spaces that you're particularly excited about from hey, folks, there's low-hanging fruit there, kind of similar to my going after contingent workforce management?
Go to the Oracle or SAP or Info or any of those websites, look at any product line and go get started, right? Like, there's ripe opportunity there in terms of the world of old legacy enterprise software. If it's not born in the cloud, the answer is there's going to be someone that's born in the cloud and a modern tech stack that's going to come through and disrupt. So yeah, I mean, that's probably how I would go about it. But again, those are slippery slopes too, right? Because then you're taking on an enterprise behemoth in the ERP category. So
let's jump into some of the questions. I think we've got some good ones. First off, question number one, any advice for a SaaS product startup that has a service component, which is essential to the overall solution offering?
So listen, most companies have to have implementation services, right? Especially if it's a long implementation. So there will be a services component and services revenue. That's not a bad thing. What is wrong or bad or a gotcha or a beware is a lot of people start consulting or services businesses. They think they're going to use the margin or the cash flow that the service business creates to then invest in product. And that's their plan to develop or fund the build of the product. That just never works out. So go raise real meaningful institutional capital, because that's the only way to go about it in these days. If you want to go ahead and build a meaningful company, because this whole I'll use services consulting revenue to actually build software product, that game never works out. Now, again, nothing wrong with having services revenue on the book, as long as you're clear, like you are an enterprise software company. Services is just to cover costs for implementation and support or things like that.
Biggest mistake?
We probably were not aggressive enough in the first couple of years. We always lived in the fear of failing and that this won't work out. In hindsight, we probably should have been more aggressive in the investments we made overall. Be it product, be it sales, be it go-to-market, we should have just been a lot more aggressive.
How do you integrate product and service?
Every major software company has like a services organization. Just make sure like services is not the revenue driver of the business. The product is the revenue driver of the business. The service is the add-on, where if you have implementation project managers, implementation BAs, all of that stuff, you're using that to cover their costs and drive a little bit of margin, but that can't be the main revenue driver of the business, because then you become a services company that has some tech rather than a tech company that offers professional services to enable the tech.
Slightly related, prior to launch, what's most important to get right? The business model or the product/service,
Where, coming back to the point I made initially, is writing down the hypothesis of how they see the space play out helps bring clarity in thinking. If you don't have that clarity day one getting started, you should take a pause and get that clarity in terms of how do you think the next 5 years of the space will play out. Without that, it's going to be really, really hard, because if you don't have conviction and if you don't have belief, it's really hard to lead a team and raise capital and things like that, because VCs will see through that.
Question from Keith: how much proof of concept did you have to prove, and how many early adopters did you secure?
So proof of concept, I already answered that in terms of product market fit, right? Like we didn't have to prove that do people need a VMS? We had to prove that why are we a better VMS? And that was very evolutionary. So it wasn't day one, customer one. It was over a period of time when we started displacing and replacing some of the older legacy systems. Today, 52% of our client count and almost 70% of our revenue comes from replacing an old VMS. So that became helpful as a proof point, right? So again, overnight, we didn't get to that number. That was very gradual in terms of how we got there, but that was the biggest proof point.
And here's another really good one. So you started your company out of Cincinnati. Did you have any challenges finding talent?
Cincinnati was a great place to actually, if I did the same company in any different part of the country where I didn't have access to the talent that I did, it probably wouldn't work out. And mainly because it's not just like, you can find people in any city in this country to write code. It's the deep, meaningful, trusting relationships of people that are willing to take the leap. It's the fact that you don't lose. If you look at Silicon Valley numbers, you lose 25% of your developers every year. So in 4 years, 100% of your workforce has churned. How long does it take to build a meaningful product and get to scale, right? So if every year, if you're losing 25% of your dev team, how are you going to build a meaningful business? We've barely had any churn. So the developers know all the details and they can move at a pace that matters. And that's the advantage, honestly, that Cincinnati has here.
For young entrepreneurs that's still a college student, how would you recommend which industry to immerse myself in if you're unsure what business idea you want to launch. Any kind of
Don't focus on the business idea. Take a job and look at a problem, right? You can find a problem on the construction site. You can find a problem at a retail store. You can find a problem at a bank. You can find a problem at a hospital. But the point is, if you are there, you're doing your job, you're understanding processes, and you start seeing like what is a problem that's worth solving, fall in love with the problem, not with the business idea, not with the solution. And once you understand the problems and the nuances, then the solution is a byproduct of you discovering the problem rather than trying to daydream and sit and come up with an idea that's unique and innovative.
Outstanding. And then one of my favorite people in the ecosystem, Mike Halloran, has asked about Web3, and obviously there's both hype and there's real there. Where do you see opportunity there?
I'm not that smart. This whole ecosystem around Web3, crypto, NFTs, all that stuff, I don't understand. I understand simple, basic enterprise software that makes large companies function, right? Like, what is the core infrastructure that a large Fortune 500 needs to operate on a daily basis? That's what I understand. That's what I play in. That's what I invest in. That's all I know.
Any other kind of perspective on just kind of finding the right people for this type of business?
Cultural fit is more important. I mean, I know people say it, and I know there are a lot of cliches around it, but it really, really does matter, because the minute you have misfits who are people who are actually really good. So again, people who don't perform well, underperformers, they are easy to deal with. The problem becomes if they're a good performer and they're not a good cultural fit, then how do you deal with it, right? So those kind of things become super tricky because you can't fire someone for performing well. Those kind of things become very tricky. So focus on that, especially in the early days.
What are inspirations to you? What kind of keeps you on the bleeding edge? Books, thought leaders, podcasts?
I mean, I don't read a whole lot these days. I used to do one book a week. I used to average almost 50 books a year. Wow. Back in the days, like 5-6 years ago. And then, of course, with the startup and travel dying down, I stopped that momentum because it's easy to do Audible when you're waiting 1 hour to board a plane and you're 2 hours on the flight. And I mean, in 3 hours, you're done with 3/4 of the book or half a book, right? So those things were a lot simpler back then. Right now, I do follow the regular TechCrunch, Crunchbase, PitchBook, all the stuff like in terms of what's happening in the startup world, what's happening in the world of enterprise software. I just keep track of that. I'm a venture partner at Bowery Capital. So we get to see firsthand a bunch of pitches and what startups are investing in and how entrepreneurs are thinking about the space. So, I mean, that's how I stay connected.
Can you say a little bit about how different venture groups added value at different stages? Like, was Madrona more helpful when you're figuring out exit, or just anything about just kind of picking those partners at the right time?
Yeah, actually, Madrona was incredibly helpful. We were very, very fortunate that we had a pretty amazing board. And that's a simple statement and it sounds like common sense, but you'll be amazed as to how many times a wrong VC, a wrong board member can take the company sideways. And we were super fortunate, right? Because as I said,
so true.
Bowery and Epic were early investors, and I'm super close to both of those teams even now. Like the fact that I'm a venture partner at Bowery and with the Epic team, I'm still super close. Battery Ventures led our A round along with Hyde Park Ventures. So Tim Kopp is someone I knew and have had a great relationship for a long time. Similarly, with Battery Ventures, Mike Brown he's the president of NVCA, the National Venture Capital Association of America. He heads that. So again, very influential, and he's been around the block a long, long time. For Series B, we had Insight. If you're familiar with what's going on in the market right now, the big three are Tiger Global, SoftBank, and Insight are the big three. So we had one of the big three investing in us, which is with Insight, and they have a whole lot of data and benchmarks around startup performance. And then Madrona, Steve Singh. Steve was the founder of Concur. He sold it to SAP for $8.4 billion. Steve has been on the board of a bunch of high growth startups like DocuSign and others. The fact that he even was willing to consider joining our board was super flattering. Steve has been a father figure and a mentor for me, and I'm still very much in touch with him. So in fact, the introduction to Workday and the executive team that led to the acquisition. Tom Bogan was the vice chairman at Workday. Anil Bushri is the co-founder, CEO, and chairman, or co-CEO and chairman. Steve knows all of them well. So there was already trust established, which in a deal process, when lawyers and other teams are negotiating terms, things can get iffy, right? If trust is already established at the board level, it basically really helps out. And that's where Steve Steve works at Madrona. He's a partner there. Madrona and Steve were just incredibly helpful throughout this journey.
And by the way, for those that, Madrona is one of the GPs that Centrifuge had invested in, and kind of our goal is to, just heighten visibility in the local deal flow, but also bring a bit of, outside in thinking into our region. So that was great perspective. I have another question, but I wanted to read something from, I just thought this might get you kind of pumped. So this is from Alex Clare, who said, a quick plug is I was the first AE hired by VNDLY. Shashank is amazing at being honest and transparent throughout the entire journey, both with clients and employees. Great leader,
What's Alex doing on this call? He should be out there selling some deals for VNDLY.
Come on, just take the compliment. Come on. No, but that's like, hey, that's the KPI that all of us as leaders kind of like look for. And then a question from, we just brought a new EIR in from, for Centrifuge from a large company. I won't name names, but he did ask, like, is there anything else, what else can the Cincinnati ecosystem or Centrifuge in particular do to help really, moving forward? Like, what else can we do, better? What can we improve upon, especially based on everything you've learned in this infinite reservoir of wisdom you have?
Honest, candid feedback. If you see ideas and pitches that won't work, at times it's actually it's painful, but it's also helpful in telling the entrepreneur, like, the odds of this working aren't super high, like, try something different or pivot. Or, the problem I've encountered in the early days is like everyone thinks everything is good, or if they just assume that you're a smart person, they assume that every decision you make is going to be right, which is obviously not the case with anyone in this world. So getting good, candid feedback early on is just super important. And I know we all try to be nice to each other, and I get all of that, but at times you could literally save an entrepreneur a year or two, and you could save investors a few $1 million up front just by being brutally honest.
And would you give that same advice to the large corporations that sometimes kind of drag out startups? Like, just a fast no, if you kind of know it's not going to go anywhere?
Works amazingly well. I wish a lot of people had said no upfront rather than,
We applaud your leadership, your confidence in Cincinnati. We're really excited about your success. And I have a feeling that a lot of great companies that launch here are going to be created by VNDLY alumni. We're really grateful for your participating. And I can just tell from looking at the chat board that there's a lot of happy campers in terms of both the energy and the expertise that you're bringing. So a very, very sincere thanks.